keep sliding down. Yeah, I feel like it's sliding down in my ear. Thank you for having us. We're incredibly happy to be here. We'll spend a good chunk of the time talking about The Killing, the American version of The Killing, and how that process worked from an American perspective. I also want to leave time to have answered any questions you might want to ask in terms of some of the things that you guys raised in the earlier session with Patricia in terms of how, perhaps from our point of view, the writing process works and the American kind of show process works, and we're happy to address any of that stuff. Before I get to that, I want to just give you a little bit of context and talk a little bit about our studio and our company, and then that'll lead into The Killing stuff. Personally, actually, I started in the feature business. I spent 20 years in it as a studio executive and as a producer, and worked on many movies that you would know and many movies that you would have contempt for. Some were good, most of them bad. It's Hollywood. But had a reasonably good career in that world, segued into television, in large part because I was a bit of a movie snob, I would have to admit. When I watched a lot of TV when I was a kid, because I was trying to avoid my parents. I'll tell you more about that in the therapeutic session later. But in the 80s and 90s, when I was working in the feature business, I really watched every movie, but watched very little television. And so from my personal perspective, and I think it's actually objectively true, the show that changed American television was The Sopranos. And when The Sopranos happened in the late 90s, it's not like there weren't many successful TV shows before that, and many very popular, and many shows that had aesthetic aspirations, but The Sopranos was so staggering, I think, an achievement, and Tony Soprano was such a superbly realized character, and I think you would be hard-pressed to find any character in American feature film that surpassed or even equaled what David Chase and his writing team was able to achieve in Sopranos. And I think that just changed the game, and people said, wow, if television can do that, then let me into that. And I think that was true for writers, for directors, for producers, and for executives. And it was around that period, or shortly afterwards, that I moved from the feature business to the television business and joined a company that was called Fox TV Studios. I could spend the entire session talking about the complexities of Fox and News Corp, which would bore some of you. But suffice to say that there are two studios at Fox that produce television shows. There's a bigger studio, not ours, called 20th Century Fox Television, that produces most of the shows that people associate with the Fox network, like 24 or Family Guy or The Simpsons or Glee. That's not ours. Our unit, Fox TV Studios, is really a unit that's oriented more towards cable. We do a little bit of reality, but mostly we do cable drama, and we've done a few things for the broadcast networks, and I could explain why we do that, but again, it's a complicated question. So our first show of note that anybody paid any real attention to was a show called The Shield, which was also probably the first show of note that was done for the FX network in the US. It turned out to be, for any of you saw it, a fairly extraordinary show, and lasted 7 years and got a lot of critical attention. And that gave us some credibility both within our own structure of News Corp and within the industry in general. And that led us then to a more aggressive pursuit of cable series. During the first half of the previous decade, I was actually more involved in doing movies for television and miniseries for our company. And it was in that way that I met Nancy, who has had a diverse background, has worked for networks and agencies and producers. And when I met her, she was working for the lunatic anti-Semite Mel Gibson. She produced a movie for us. I then, after one of Mel's particularly flagrant explosions, I was managed to lure her into her company, and I was very grateful for that event.
And that's another seminar.
That's another seminar. It would be much longer than this one's ever going to be. So it was really around that time, 5 or 6 years ago, that we entered the series business in earnest, and started to try to find material. How do we find material? Well, as a studio, we're especially as a newer studio within the industry, we were trying to attract people to come to us. And really, the unsung hero from the American side of how The Killing came to be is a guy named Mikkel Bondesen. Mikkel is a Dane. I forgive him for that. It's a joke. But he's a wonderful literary manager and represents a lot of American writers. But he's also very plugged into the American scene in general. but he and we made a deal with him, as we've made a deal with a number of non-writing producers to bring us material. And Mikkel called one day and said, "There's this show that I've been watching in Denmark called The Killing, and it's fantastic, and it gets like a 70 share." And being a smartass, I said, "Well, is that good? Is there one network? I don't know anything about Denmark." I was very arrogant and very American, which I guess is probably synonyms. But he said, "No, this is really a fantastic show," and he showed it to us, and obviously the Danish version lived up to everything that Mikkel said, and it's an extraordinary piece of work, and continues to be an extraordinary piece of work, and you know, in our jobs, we spend a lot of time looking for shows that have been produced overseas in all parts of the world, looking to see where there's potential for something to be remade in the U.S. And sometimes we see something and there's the germ of an idea, but you feel like you have to throw out a lot of aspects to it as either being, quote, not good enough as a subjective judgment, or just things that you need to change radically for the U.S. market. In the case of The Killing, however, it just, you know, every aspect of it worked. It was so extraordinarily well acted and produced and directed and written. And so we felt, gee, this is a case where we really can be very, very grateful to and beholden to the original material. And it was really with that spirit of respect that all of us approached the material and continue to. So after Mikkel brought it to us, we made a deal to remake the show in the U.S. We brought it to a writer named Aveny Sud, S-U-D. Aveny is female. Aveny is of diverse background. Just thought I would point that out. There are women who work in Hollywood. There are people who are over 40 who work in Hollywood. I am over 40. I'm not female, but I work in Hollywood. So there are ways to survive ageism. I keep telling myself that. I'll keep telling you that in case you need to employ somebody in the future. In any case, Aveny had a interesting background of her own, and that she had, on the one hand, had a version of a traditional Hollywood experience. She had run a show called Cold Case, which was a Jerry Bruckheimer show, and she'd done that successfully, but she'd also written a number of things that were much more ambitious in a sense of kind of beyond that classic Jerry Bruckheimer CBS procedural kind of mode, and we knew that she could both tell a really good mystery story, but also go into more adventurous places. And she obviously had enormous respect for the original, and then we brought it to the AMC network in the U.S. And probably many of you know that AMC has been the home of some really good shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad. And Nancy actually originally brought it to one of the younger executives, Ben Davis, there, and who was champion of it. But the really interesting, I thought, telltale sign of why we knew AMC was a good home for the show was the head of AMC, a guy named Joel Stillerman, had been given the DVD to watch and was not really watching it. It was just kind of sitting at his desk. And so at one point, somebody, maybe Nancy, maybe Mikkel, I don't remember, said, "Can you call Joel and bug him to watch it?" And so I called him, and he said, "Oh, okay, I'll watch it this weekend." And he watched it, and he called back early that Monday morning and said, "Yeah, that was really good, dude. Could you send me a couple more episodes of that?" And he was a busy guy. He's reading his own things and watching his own things. So he said, "Oh, he wants to watch more episodes. That's a good sign." So we sent him, I think, 2 more episodes, and he called back like the next day and said, "Yeah, that was really good too. Can you send us the rest?" And we sent him the other 17 episodes because there were 20 of the first 2 seasons. And he actually watched the whole thing. And when you get a U.S. network head to watch 20 episodes of the Danish property, you're in good shape. So we knew we actually had a very eager buyer. And so although during the period of it, it seemed like it was a painfully long process at every step. Actually, in retrospect, it was remarkably smooth. Aveny wrote a script. The script that she wrote was quite faithful to the Danish show, and B, the network was really quite happy even with the first draft. We went through a number of other drafts, dealing with some network notes and some studio notes, but really by the standards of what U.S. development processes usually are, it was quite painless and quite simple. And then we went about the process of trying to cast it. One of the differences between broadcast shows and cable shows is that broadcast shows or broadcast pilots are invariably cast very, very quickly because, as probably many of you know, the broadcast shows go through this extremely rigid calendar where they're all greenlit around the same time, essentially now. They are all then cast during essentially the same time, January, February. They're all roughly shot in March, April. They're all roughly go through post-production through the rest of April. They're all really delivered sometime around the end of April, beginning of May, and then decisions are made in the middle of May and they're announced in very fancy presentations in New York called the upfronts, and that cycle is almost unbroken. There are rare exceptions where networks try to go, quote, off cycle, but invariably it happens during that process, and so the network casting process is a frenzy. Cable, on the other hand, pilots get developed and greenlit at all sorts of periods during the year, so the casting process could actually be much more thoughtful and deliberate. And AMC was actually really good in the sense that they gave us time to cast it, while they were actors and actresses of a little bit more name-ish by U.S. standards appeal that were interested and potentially available to us. They were very supportive of us casting actors who were not names for the U.S. market.
And coincidentally, we did end up casting at the same time as all the broadcast networks, but because it was cable and because of the auspices and people had seen the script, we found a lot of actors who didn't want to necessarily go on to a broadcast pilot were drawn to the material, which was very lucky for us.
So we cast Maureen as Sarah. We cast this Swedish guy that some of you know, Joel Kinnaman, to play Holder, and actually at the outset of that process, we recruited a director named Patty Jenkins to direct it, and Patty actually came a little bit out of AMC's desire to have a more feature filmish, less televisionish director, and they actually initially threw out names that were impossible to attain, like David Fincher and people like that. But we had actually been developing another project with Patty. Patty had previously directed a movie called Monster, for which Charlize Theron won the Academy Award, and directed a little bit of television, a few episodes, but had never directed a pilot. But we had a really good experience with Patty developing an original script, and so we nominated her, and she got the job. And actually, last Saturday night, she won in the U.S. the Directors Guild Award for Best Episode of Television, from a director's point of view. So we were very proud of Patty for that. In any case, Patty directed the pilot, and
by the way, also just to counteract the exception to the rule, we felt very lucky that just the icing on the cake was that the person that we had to write our American version was a woman, and the person who ended up directing it was a woman. Still unusual, but it's great that we have it. We like to think that too. We like to think
not the only reason. No, I frequently.
But noticed.
I frequently felt like the token guy in the room. It happened last night.
Because you were.
I don't like where this is going. But in any case, so the pilot got made, and it was, and I think there were few people who didn't think it was an extraordinary pilot. We were fortunate enough to therefore get a relatively, again, all things being relative, quick pickup to series, so we went into production on season 1. We recruited a writing staff. Again, Vina, I think, was at pains to try to come up with a staff of diverse perspective. Her two lieutenants, her two principal numbers two, however that goes, are a writing team, both of which happen to be women, and who we'd actually worked with before, Dawn Prestwich and Nicole Yorkin on another show, which they had co-run for us as well, but assembled a number of different writers. And we went at the task of trying to adapt the Danish version, which again we tried to stay with very faithfully. But one thing we determined, very very swiftly, was we didn't want anybody who had seen the Danish version to think that they knew what the ending was. So we knew very quickly we had to therefore come up with a different killer. And once you do that, then a lot of things, subtle things, but a lot of things had to change from that decision. Also, just simply shifting something from Denmark to America changes things. I mean, we chose Seattle to base the show in part because Seattle is a city where the sun never shines, and the show makes Seattle look a little rainier than it actually is, but not that much rainier. I produced a movie there 20 years ago, and I was there for 6 months, and I saw sunshine 2 days, and so I guess that's what the city is. Seattle also has the highest suicide rate of any country in the U.S. I'm sure those two statistics are not related whatsoever. But in any case, we claim Seattle as our place of shooting. We actually shot in Vancouver. We theoretically could have shot in Seattle since the places are very close to each other, but Seattle has no cast base really and no crew base, and Vancouver is probably 20% cheaper because of the Canadian tax rebates, so that's why we went there.
And I think similarly, we did go and shoot. We did some aerial shooting, so so we could get a sense of Seattle, and then
Well, yeah, the team and second unit, but most everything shot in Vancouver. Writing was based in Los Angeles. Editorial was based in Los Angeles. Most of the principal cast, not all, but most of the principal cast came from the U.S., although we got probably, I would say, a slightly surprising number of Canadians cast up there who we might have initially predicted would have needed to be Americans. Most of the directors, I think probably all the directors were Americans. Mm-hmm. And then we went about the process of making the show. Probably, in some respects, one of the most fortunate decisions I think that we made is and it was a decision everybody came to very quickly and very excitedly, was that we managed to persuade the composer in the Danish version to compose our version. Franz, who's sitting somewhere here, composed both the Danish and the American versions, and we are very grateful to him for all of this extraordinary work on the show. And we, I'm sure Piv would agree. I think the music is a very profound character in both versions of the show. So that was another act of homage. In the show we shot, as Patricia was talking about earlier, 7-day episodes in the show. It was, all of our shows are 7-day shows, and we produce a number of other shows, which I'll parenthesis that in a second. But the pilot was longer.
Yeah, I think we shot 14 days, but then once the show is picked up, then we go into the 7 days. As you were saying, also means that if a show shoots every 7 days, it means you need a script every 7 days. So
right. And by the way, cable pilots tend. These are norms as opposed to speaking to every single example. But cable pilots tend to shoot 12 to 14 days for hours. Broadcast pilots shoot a couple days longer than that, 15, 16, something like that. It depends on the show. We always have to exclude HBO because HBO operates with a lot more money and therefore much different financial and schedule parameters than anybody else does. But in general, that's sort of the difference between basic cable and broadcast. In general, basic cable's episodes shoot in 7 days. Again, we're speaking about hours. Broadcast shows can be 8 or higher. Some are less, but in general, broadcast shows tend to have slightly longer schedules. So we went into production of the show. We had a lot of the usual challenges, but fortunately, I think the scripts managed to gel very quickly. The cast managed to gel very quickly.
I think we had, just to get in technical, to speak to questions you had earlier, I think we've had 12 weeks of writer prep, which is a little longer than we normally do for our cable shows. So the writers had a little bit of time to start breaking stories and getting us outlines, and I think we had 2 or 3 scripts by the time we started shooting the beginning of December. And also knowing that we were going to have an extra little writing padding time, because then you get your 2 weeks at Christmas where everybody else gets to rest and the writers have to go and frantically write through their holidays so they can try to catch up and not get too far behind in January.
And actually, from a studio perspective, we thought that was slightly generous because we had already a lot of really good stories from the Danish version. Thank you. So, but they felt they needed the time, and we wanted to be supportive, so we gave them that time.
We had to come up with a new killer. So.
Right. By the way, just to append this, there is sort of a triangular process in television production, and maybe this is becoming clearer. But on the one hand, you have the showrunner and the writer and his creative team. You have the studio. You have the network. There are occasions where the latter two become sort of collapsed, for example, in HBO, but might produce something itself, and there may be no traditional studio as part of that triangle. But in general, it is a triangular process where the studio and the network are different entities working. Sometimes the studio and the network might be the same larger parent company. It might be sort of an ABC Studios producing something for an ABC network. That frequently happens in broadcast. Happens less frequently, sometimes, but less frequently in cable. In our case, we were a separate company entirely from AMC, which is the network. And that triangular process, like most triangles, is sometimes complicated and provocative, but usually kind of healthy. As our position sort of in the vertex of the triangle, we are frequently trying to protect the showrunner against what we perceive as the depredations of the network, and vice versa. And sometimes we're just trying to help the two sides communicate with each other. Invariably, of course, we have our own perspective and our own vision and our own sense of what we think a show should be, and that's what we're trying to do, working with the writers we're working with the networks we're working with. But you know, we also actually physically make the we co-finance the show. We work with the producers we're working with. We work with the writers. We work with the non-writing producers. But we are responsible for the business affairs, the physical production, the post-production. We distribute the shows around the world. We distribute them in DVD and SVOD and all the different outlets. And the U.S. network controls the show ultimately because they have the final decision-making process. They have the final yes or no. But they only exhibit the show on the U.S. broadcast network. We retain all the rest of our rights. And in general, I think, just to go to touch on the studio a little bit larger as well, you know, right now we produce, besides The Killing, which we're extraordinarily proud of, we produce, among other things, a show called Burn Notice, which is on the USA Network, and is going into its 6th season. A show called White Collar, which is also a USA Network and going into its 4th season. A show called The Glades, which is on the A&E Network, which is going into its 2nd season. We produced, I mentioned The Shield. We produced a show called Saving Grace with Holly Hunter for TNT for 4 years. We produced a show called The Riches with Eddie Izzard and Minnie Driver, which was on the FX Network for a couple of years. We're in post-production on a pilot for Lifetime. We're in post-production on a pilot for AMC. We're casting 2 pilots, one for USA and one for FX. We do a little bit of reality. We have a reality show called The Great Escape that will be on in the summer for TNT. So we do a lot of diverse things, and we actually have produced a few shows for broadcast network in what we call a straight-to-series model that, again, probably too complicated for this forum, but I'll talk about later. We have a number of non-writing producers that we've made deals with. One is sitting in the audience, Melinda Jason, who will be happy to read and watch any damn thing you please. So she's right here, so you'll get to know her. And she's in large part responsible for us coming here, so thank you. But we have a number of non-writing producers whose job it is to kind of look for material for us and to help us find projects and help us find writers. We develop a lot of our own material from scratch. The Killing obviously was not that case, but we spend a lot of time looking for ideas, looking for writers, looking for books, looking for magazine articles, looking for true stories, looking for anything that feels like it could possibly suggest itself as a series. And at any given juncture, we probably have 25 or 30 things that we're developing that are at networks, again, mostly cable networks whom we sell to, and then we probably have an additional 25 or 30 things that we have that are being written internally, where we've commissioned scripts or treatments or whatever, so that we can get a script in shape and then go and present projects to network as finished scripts, as finished things. Sometimes we just bring them oral pitches. Sometimes we'll bring them finished scripts. It just sort of depends on our judgment of what's the best way to find a home for something. And that's kind of what we do all day, is we kind of look for that. The one reason we're here is that, you know, post The Killing, we realized, and again in our insular American manner, if there's The Killing, there must be other things up here that must be good. So we have a number of other projects that we're already deeply into. We bought the rights to a Danish show called Lulu and Leon with Thomas Gemmeltoft, who's there, which is actually going along very well. And that was a project where we, with Melinda, who brought us that project, and Thomas, we hired a writer, we had that script written internally. We've now sold it to a network in the U.S. At Lifetime, and we're going to make that as a 2-hour movie, but also it's intended to be a pilot, what we call a backdoor pilot. So we will hopefully just sneak it into series production through that route. We've bought a number of other things. I was talking earlier with the producer of a show called Dog, which we bought the rights to, which is a half-hour comedy. We bought the rights to a Danish property called Man with the Golden Ear, which we set up at the AMC network, and we're trying to make, as well as commissioning the writers of that project, Swinner and Bondi, to write an original script for us. And there's a number of other things that we're pursuing, and because we learned that there's a lot of talent in this room and rooms like it in this part of the world. So we're out avariciously scavenging for things, and again, that's why we're here, or just for the pleasure of listening to ourselves talk, which is incredibly entertaining. But that's really, as a studio, how we function. Is that we're kind of scouting all the time and working with writers, and as Patricia said, I mean, in television, the writer is the king. I spent a long time in the feature business, and the feature business is also noted as a director/star-driven business. I would actually say the star is the most important thing in the feature business, but depending on but there are certain directors who are quote stars in their own rights, and there are certain pictures that are made without stars, and in that case, then it is more director-driven. But in television, it is absolutely about the writer, and therefore, really, your power, either as a non-writing producer or as in our case, as studio executives, is our relationship with the writers. And if the writers trust us, and if the writers feel like what we have to say is reasonably intelligent and delivered with sufficient humility and also respect for what the writer's doing, then you have influence over the process, and you can actually help something work. And if you try to be just purely authoritarian and treat writers like shit and give them a hard time, you're probably not going to get anywhere, and then you end up being rendered functionally useless. So really, our principal mission is to make writers feel like they're in a place where they can feel trusted, and when we agree with them, it's because we honestly and truly agree with them, and we'll fight like hell to have them win their point of view. And when we disagree with them, it's not just for the sake of disagreement. It's because we think we have an honest and intelligent perspective that maybe counter to what they're thinking, and maybe out of that disagreement comes something better. Maybe out of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis process comes actual improvement. And I think that it goes back to triangles, where I think the actual triangle process is useful, and why I actually even think the showrunner process and the writing room process, which we talked about earlier, is actually useful and healthy. And even if there are occasional moments of wrath and displeasure, there is that counterpoint. There is that group of intelligent people who are second-guessing ideas and trying to make them better. That can frequently just lead to better work. And I think for a good writer who is thoughtful about the input that they're getting, if they are able to sort of listen first to their rooms and then to the studio and then to the network about the things they're trying to do, and take the input that's useful, and sometimes input is wrong, sometimes input isn't helpful, but take the input that is helpful and try to use that to make their work better, that's where the best work comes from. Then you've already had your kind of work tested by an intelligent audience, and hopefully that intelligent audience will have gotten rid of many of the hurdles that otherwise would just be thrown at the general audience, who would then be just pissed off because the show wasn't good enough.
And also, just in terms of watching the process of the killing, specifically, Vina she's extremely organized, which you have to be when you're, running a show that's shooting every 7 days. But what we've also observed is, so she has her writer's room, and then after the first few weeks, when they're sort of breaking the broader strokes, as soon as shows are assigned, and she has, I think, including her writer's assistant, who she actually lets write a script and will get credit, people start to peel away because they're off writing their outline, and then each writer gets to go to Vancouver and produce their episode. And she has a senior writer, then a junior writer, then a senior writer, then a junior writer. So one writer is up prepping their episode while another writer is on set while it's shooting, and because she is alternated between a senior writer and a junior writer, she knows when there's always a senior writer up in Vancouver at all times in case there's a big issue. And she also felt, because it's such a serialized show, that the writers, because we have directors who come in and out all the time, but the writers are going to be the ones who are going to have all the answers. They're the continuity. And we also, Mikkel has a producer who works with him. Kristen Campo was very instrumental also in helping develop the show, and she is up in Vancouver also providing continuity. So there's a machinery and a craft to try to get all of this to stay cohesive, to keep a look that, you know, is united when we have directors coming in and out and different writers writing drafts. And sometimes Vina does have to do more writing on episodes written by some writers than others, but a lot of times by the time the studio and network get that draft, she has already taken a pass, so we don't know what the writer's draft looked like. So she's trying to keep it as seamless, and it doesn't mean that we won't have notes, and right now we're really, you know, in the soup where, you know, we're getting the outline for the 10th episode and the rewrite of the 7th, and they're shooting the 6th, and we just watched a rough cut of the 3rd, and you're like, oh my God, wait, where is Sarah now? What clue are we following? So it's an interesting dance to keep track of, but it's instructive for us as much as, you know, we're there also help to give guidance.
So pick up on that. So as Nancy just said, we're getting lost. Okay. Well, that's different, isn't it? So I can hear myself a lot louder. I liked myself before. So anyway, as Nancy said, we are halfway through shooting season 2, which is different than how the Danish version thinks of itself as season 2, because we think of ourselves just as doing our 13-episode seasons. We pissed a lot of the U.S. audience at the end of season 1 because we didn't tell the audience who the killer was, and again, that was out of fealty to the original Danish version that took 20 episodes to reveal who its killer was, so we were going to take 26 to reveal who ours was, but that's not how American television usually works, so there was a lot of flack, particularly off this thing called the internet, which said, how could you not tell those? But, you know, sorry, that's what we did. So the second season will come back on April 1st, and 12 weeks later, the world at large will know who killed Rosie Larson. But actually, we have something which hopefully will be entertaining for you. We're going to show you, you're actually literally the first audience to see 2 clips from season 2. And really, other than us and the network, nobody's seen this stuff. What you'll see is the first clip is literally the first couple minutes of the first episode of season 2. And for those of you who didn't watch any of season 1 of the U.S. version of The Killing, you won't know what's going on. But suffice to say that a lot of shit has gone down, and Sarah is just trying to catch up with what the audience has known about somebody getting shot. And then after that clip, we'll show you another clip where our Sarah gets to meet
a surprise
character, who those of you who've seen the Danish version will recognize. So, do you want to run those 2 clips?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, by the way, the first episode of the season was directed by Agnieszka Holland, who directed the, also a woman, also of authority.
Polish.
So, anyway, should we open this up to questions and comments?
Let's. I'm just going to begin when you said when you talked to Mikkel about the original series, he said that it had a 70% market share, and you were like, "Is that any good?"
I was being a smartass.
Yeah, of course. So could you just tell us a little bit about the success of The Killing in the States? Like, how many viewers did it have, and could you put that into context? What does it actually mean to have that and that many millions?
No, it's a good question. When we talk about ratings, we used to talk only about one thing, which was how many people watched it live in the first viewing. That used to be a very simple conversation. It's gotten much more complicated. First of all, broadcast networks basically run things once. Sometimes they'll run things twice as a rerun, but in a given week, they'll run things one time. Cable networks will run things 5, 6, 7 times, 4 times during that initial week. So the cable networks look at what is called a a cum, or a cumulative rating. So we'll look at the first rating of that initial airing. So let's say The Killing runs on AMC Sunday night at 10, but then it will run another 4 or 5 times during that week. So it's not just that those people watch it the first time; they'll watch it during the course of that week in other viewings. They'll also, and we were talking about this last night. One thing that has gotten incredibly meaningful in the U.S. is how many people watch things on DVR, on TiVo, on any kind of time-shifted measure. So, so you're now looking at ratings for certain kinds of shows, and The Killing would certainly qualify, where as much as your rating may go up as much as 60 to 70% after you factor in the people who are watching it on a live +7 basis, i.e., who are watching it within the next 7 days after they initially recorded it. So, to your question, in terms of the people who watch it on Sunday night at 10 o'clock live, we were averaging about 2.5 million people who watch. Now, by broadcast standards, that's a low number. I mean, broadcast shows can, a modest success in broadcast is probably 7 million viewers. And a huge hit is something like American Idol, which maybe 20 million plus, but there are very few shows like that in America. A very successful show may be anywhere from 7 million or 8 million to 12 million. A very successful cable show, it can be. There are cable shows which have as many as 5-6 million people on their initial viewing. A show like Walking Dead, or a show like True Blood, or a show like actually one of our shows, Burn Notice, gets numbers similar to that. So The Killing number may not sound like much compared to that, but based on all of it, you're probably all the things I talked about earlier. It was probably averaging somewhere around 6 to 7 million people viewing it, which for a show like that, which is a show which is obviously it's more creatively ambitious. It's not. It's not paced the same way traditional American shows are. We thought that was a great number. On the AMC network, it was their second most successful show. It's nowhere near as successful as The Walking Dead is for them, ratings-wise, but it was more successful than Mad Men or Breaking Bad at a comparable periods in their run. So they were very happy with the results.
Yeah, and of course, if you watch the first episode, you're going to watch the other ones as well.
I certainly hope so.
Because they belong together.
Mm-hmm.
So let's open up for comments and questions from the audience. Now I have a very bright light. Mm-hmm. Let's see. There's one up there. Please go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, what was the budget for the series?
Okay, the question was, what was the budget for The Killing?
The budget for the pilot, we shot it, as I said, in Vancouver, so we look at a quote, a gross number and a net number. Gross number means how much they actually spent, but the net number means after we get the tax rebate back from Canada, how much was that? So I believe the gross number was it was somewhere in the low 5s, and the net number was probably somewhere in the mid 4s for the pilot. Then when we started shooting the series, we were averaging on an episode basis. Again, a gross number was probably around 2.6, something like that, and the net number was probably about 2 million, 2.1 million.
And is there any chance you can share with us how much the format fee was for the
There's a chance, but it won't happen. No, I mean, obviously, you can ask Pim that. No, look, I'm not really comfortable talking about specific deal numbers, but deals are made in different ranges, and I think that from our perspective, we thought it was a long negotiation, and we felt like we came up with a deal which was very fair to all sides.
Well, I wanted to ask you how you found Joel Kinnaman. Of course, for us here in Sweden, it's interesting. Joel Kinnaman. Joel Kinnaman.
You wanted to go to that, Nancy?
Joel put himself on tape, and we were in the casting room, and we had lots of people come in and audition, and some actors that were fairly well known, and and we were laughing because he put himself on tape, and then his U.S. agents called and said, "He's the Brad Pitt of Sweden," and we watched his tape and we said, he is the Brad Pitt of Sweden. He's really great. I know David was sort of the lone, he took the most convincing of anybody.
I did.
Of all the auditions, though, he just stood out. he just had an interesting way, and it felt like he owned the role, and I think it excited Vina too when she saw this is an actor that I'm going to want to write to, and then he flew in the next day, and I think he was really jet lagged, but anyway, we really liked his quality, and the network really liked his quality, and
So it just happened to be a bonus that he's also from a Nordic
it just
country.
happened to be a bonus.
Yeah.
No, we didn't set out saying, let's find a Swedish actor to play this part. That was not the intent.
So, please go ahead, the woman in the green.
Yes. Oh, it's no, that.
I'll just repeat the question for the camera. The question was about Netflix and how that affects production of series.
Well,
First, you could maybe explain a little bit what it is.
all right. Again, I don't know what's currently taking place here, but one thing that has radically changed the U.S. television economics is the advent of what's called subscription video on demand, which is most meaningfully Netflix, but is also, and I'll get to also companies like Amazon and Google, which basically are companies where you can. It's called subscription video on demand because you pay a subscription, you pay a monthly fee. It used to be $9.95, and now I think it's now up to $14.95 a month, and you can watch any movie or television show that is on that video service. And it's a great thing for the consumer, and I'm a consumer, and we have Netflix, and my daughter watches every kid's show that she could possibly watch. And it's fantastic for them. But it's very odd for the television studio because up until a couple of years ago, where we stood to make a lot of our money was on DVD sales. And especially shows like The Killing, or shows that were serialized shows, there were, as you said, more addictive kind of shows. The tradition was that a lot of people who would not necessarily be able or willing to watch every episode as it aired would say, I'll wait and I'll just go buy the box set and I'll watch all 13 or 22 episodes of the show on a DVD set. And a lot of people, fans, would consume shows that way. And that was good for us because it was easy to monetize. It was easy to say, okay, you go out and you spend $39.95 to buy your DVD set, and we'd get X portion of that, and the artists, the writers, the creators would get X portion of that. And it was a great system, and we could, and the shows that did well on DVD. The Shield was a really good example for us. We made money. Everybody made money. It's really easy to track. Well, then the world changed and Netflix came about, and so now it's really hard because you, the consumer, you're paying one amount. You could watch one show a month. You could watch 500 shows a month. Netflix doesn't tell us. We don't know, and so we don't know whether you're watching our show, The Killing, a lot on Netflix or not at all on Netflix. So we make one amount of money, whether the show is watched one time or 500 times, as opposed to you have a DVD out there. If you sell 5,000 units, if you sell 50,000 units, you make a corresponding and proportionate amount of money. So what is good for Netflix for us is that we have sold many of our shows, and we in fact have just sold The Killing to Netflix, so that we get a one-time fee, which per episode, which we then make, and the fee depends on the particular show and the particular negotiation, which then we can. Then those revenues get passed along to the creators in their proportion of it. But it's a one-time fee, and it doesn't really account for something being extraordinarily successful or extraordinarily unsuccessful in that afterlife. So it really is ultimately not nearly as good for us as the DVD business was. That said, you can't reverse technology. The technology will always expand and get more complicated. So Netflix is something that we look at in a positive way because it's a way for us to say, well, here's a show, and it's going to cost X, and we don't think it's going to travel very well for a variety of reasons. It's not going to sell internationally as well as we thought. Can we really justify the show? Well, how much do we think we can get out of Netflix? Or Hulu is a different service. But there's not as much money on Hulu or those services. Right now, there's much more money on Netflix. But if you feel you can get enough money from those other sources, then maybe you can still afford to finance the show. For example, comedy tends to historically travel less well than drama. It's not always true, and certain comedies do travel, but in general, comedy travels more difficultly. I don't think difficultly is a word, but you know what I meant. Sorry. So it may be that the Netflix sale is the difference between being able to greenlight a show and not being able to greenlight a show. So that has become sort of the latest sort of financial windfall. Now, having said that, if you follow U.S. business patterns at all, Netflix has gone wildly up and down over the last 6 to 9 months in terms of its stock, in terms of its perception. Are they pissing off such and such a company? Are they losing product? It has rivals now, and Amazon and other things. So, as much as last year, if you were sitting in my job, Netflix would come up in virtually every conversation. That might not be true a year from now. I mean, one of the things that we all obviously know is, and you all know it, is technology changes incredibly fast, and the ways people watch shows seem to change year by year and faster, and the economics don't necessarily keep up. So it's right now Netflix is a great thing, mostly, although it's not as great as DVD was. It may or may not be as meaningful the next time I see you.
So, but when you sell the season, is it there then forever, or does it disappear at some point?
Well, they buy it for a certain number of years.
Yeah.
And at some
but
point
it's
their
about
license
years
expires.
more than months.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's years, and at a certain point their license expires, unless they choose to pay and renew it.
Yeah. Thomas, did you have a?
Do you see another business model for that? I mean, in the future, now you're talking. There's been a decline in the income, the net profit, and we as a player could be one of those saying we don't want to sell this. I mean, because if we want to go our own way, we can see another business model which we find more interesting and that will keep alive our product.
What we hope for, if I could control where because if I could choose, well,
The
if I could
business,
really choose,
an alternative business model.
I'm sorry. Tomas asked, what are we hoping for in terms of how the business models will evolve, and what will if Netflix is troubled, what are we aspiring to? Look, since technology never goes backwards, and since we can't revisit the DVD model, what we're hoping for is that there are other systems that become competitive. What is difficult for us right now is that Netflix is essentially a monopoly in terms of spending the kind of money that they spend, and they're the only company that spends it. So we're very dependent on a company whose fortunes we can't trust. And Netflix, in its own way, I mean, they're now. What's interesting is they're starting to, in fact, commission original programming. There are certain shows that will appear only on Netflix in the U.S., and they're spending a lot of money on that. How that will impact then their fortunes, and whether they'll be as much in the acquisition business as they've been or not, who knows? If they made a very expensive bet on their first original quote production, which is a Kevin Spacey, David Fincher show. If that fails massively, how will that change things? Maybe it will change things a lot. Maybe it won't change things at all. But we hope that there are competitive companies. We hope that Amazon steps up in a major way. They've started to, certainly not at the Netflix level, but they started to. We hope that Google and other services will start to. Competition's always good for us.
And not only in terms of distribution, but if Netflix is buying, we're sellers, we're producers. It's one more buyer for us to sell product, from the beginning, as opposed to not just as a lay it from a network.
About piracy also, which I think is very important, is because Netflix definitely have a business model that will give a lot of people a chance to see for a fairly amount of money, fairly low amount of money, the thing that they want to see. And whereas it doesn't provide us any profits to produce.
Well, it's. I mean, obviously, the whole anti-piracy thing is a gigantic issue around the world, and certainly in the U.S. And it's oddly characterized Hollywood as the evil empire who's just trying to exploit the consumer, and the internet as the bastion of freedom, when in fact the people who are being hurt as badly as Hollywood is are the artists who are creating things and getting nothing for it. But in the way that things have been positioned. The internet has had a much better way of sort of presenting themselves than Hollywood has. So their influence on Congress has been a lot stronger. You know, I think in the best of all possible worlds, we would figure out a way to monetize shows in the way that the DVD business was monetized, in the sense that you could, as you would with music, say, oh, I want to watch an episode of The Killing, I'll pay for that episode. I'll even if it's a nominal, very extremely nominal amount of money. Now, I don't know if this is feasible because subscription has gotten so prevalent, but if there was a way to account where we could get paid, and therefore everybody could get paid for every single time somebody watched a Killing episode or an episode of any given program, that would be a lot fairer way for us to know what we were making and how much we deserve to make and how much we deserve to pass along, as opposed to making, we get the same amount for a piece of shit as we do for something that's really good. I mean, and in a way that's good for us because it protects us of the things that fail, but it doesn't really protect the things that work.
Åsa, did you want to say something?
I have a question which is linked to this, and that's how important the international sales revenues are when it comes to the internet, where things are sort of traveling without borders, and Netflix are hoping for
Right.
not working global. What would that mean to the business?
So the question was the importance of international sales.
Well, I mean, there's kind of two parts to your question. I mean, for us as a company that both produces TV shows and distributes them internationally, the value of something internationally is incredibly important for us to make the decisions we make on shows. I mean, so when we are looking at the opportunity to produce something, really the first question we ask, far more than anything we're talking about vis-a-vis Netflix or anything else, is how well will it travel? How will this do in England and Germany and France and Scandinavia and all the rest of the parts of the world? And those things are hard to predict, and as it would be, you don't know what's going to work on your network. I mean, if you always did, everything would be a huge success. But which I'm sure it is anyway. But we absolutely do look at things that are too, quote, American, and we rely on our international people and the conversations they have with people like you, and obviously ultimately you guys come and look at shows at May screenings or other things, and that's ultimately where we get verdict, but we have to make decisions much earlier. So we're trying to predict how things will travel, and we're making guesses, and sometimes, again, we're right and wrong about those things. But as you have concerns about piracy, that obviously deeply impacts you, it impacts us. Anything that drives people away from your networks is bad for us. We obviously want the most revenue we can get from network sales. So no, it's a fiendish problem. And what's so frustrating is we can't even get our own government to help us. And we lobby incredibly aggressively, and we've not publicly clearly not had very much success. But no, we really are forced to think very globally because at any given show that we make, we tend to make at a deficit that is somewhere roughly around $1 million an episode in cable, and it frequently is much higher than that in broadcast. But in cable, it's roughly about $1 million. Sometimes it's less than that. And most of that deficit we look to recoup by selling shows around the world. It's, as you know, frequently difficult to sell a show in its first year. Unless there's some reason why it's particularly attractive to those in international networks. So usually a show needs some imprimatur of success in America before it really is able to be sold in a number of territories. So we take on a big risk in a year one show, and a show that lasts a year and is canceled is financially really painful for us. And we really, in order for a show to really be successful for us, it needs to stay on the air for, in cable, probably at least 5 years before we really start to be in any kind of profitable place, because at that point you've accumulated enough episodes that it has a real afterlife to it.
Okay, we had a question up there.
Well, it's a good question. We have it. The DVD of The Killing has not come out yet. I mean, actually, the season 1 is coming out in the U.S. in simultaneous with the air date of season 2, actually coming out a couple weeks earlier. So I believe the street date for the DVD of the U.S. version is March 13th, and internationally it will start to roll out after that. So I can't really speak to that success or failure because it hasn't happened yet. What I can tell you, and I think what I think is interesting, is that where the two versions have coexisted, for example, in the UK, the Danish version did extraordinarily well. The U.S. version did really well too. I think I would suspect that there are people who watched both shows, but I would also suspect that people who only watched one or the other. The Danish version obviously went out first and got a tremendous critical response, and to some extent, I think the U.S. version was compared to it critically, and some people felt that the U.S. version was not as good as the Danish version. But the U.S. version still did really well, and there were also people who felt like the U.S. version had its own creative value and respected it for what it was. So, look, in terms of, I think the people who buy DVD sets are usually passionate fans of something. So, if somebody's a passionate fan of The Killing and they've gone out and they've spent whatever the Danish version costs on DVD, if they like the U.S. version, they'll probably want to buy that too. So I'm not that worried about it. I mean, I think, had we made a shitty piece, we would have gotten doubly punished for having ruined what was done in Denmark, and we've really tried not to ruin it, and I think most people have taken it for that as sort of if they're fans of the original, they see it as a respectful homage with some differences, but as basically a respectful piece that hopefully works on its own terms. And for the people who don't know the Danish show, they can just enjoy it as a fresh piece of drama.
How many shows that go from pitching to success? How many do you start with, and how much do you end up with?
There's no way to answer that question without sounding dispiriting, because there are a phenomenal number of things that are being pitched every day, and I mean, Nancy and I, and we have 5 other colleagues who work with us in the creative group of our studio. So the 7 of us are listening to, meeting with, reading all sorts of things every day. So probably, if each, let's just say hypothetically that each of us is looking at 10 things a week, and that's probably conservative. Call it 100 things a week as a group for easy math. So you're talking 5,000 projects that come our way during a year. That's some of them can be oral pitches, many of them can be written pieces of material of some kind or another. So out of those 5,000 things we consume, we may decide to get in business on 100, maybe, of which maybe we actually set up at a network, maybe half of that, 40 or 50, of which we actually go to pilot on maybe 5 or 6, of which get on the air, maybe 3 or 4, of which stay on the air, 2 or 3. Now, having said that, we're one company, and there's a lot of other companies. So there's a lot of studios, there's a lot of networks. Right now, there are over 100 scripted dramas on cable. That's a lot. And broadcast, there's, my math isn't fast enough to do it, but there's probably, say, another 100 shows that are on broadcast. There's a couple hundred shows that are on the air. Those couple hundred shows all, employ somewhere between 5 and 10 writers. So you've got a lot of writers working. So there's and there's tremendous amounts of things that get developed. Obviously, way more get developed than actually get made. And for all the intimidating for all the difficulty of the odds that I had just presented you, there are increasing numbers of different ways shows are getting made. I mean, there are companies like Hulu and Netflix, et cetera, that are making their trying to make their own material. There are networks that are, everybody's looking and saying, what can we do that's new? What can we do that's different? The network in the U.S. that I'm not sure if people even here know what it is, called IFC, that independent film channel that was kind of a couple years ago had kind of obscure movies that landed in festivals. It now has, I think, in a show called Portlandia, one of the best comedies that's on in the U.S. right now. It's an extraordinarily good show, and from a network that was literally not on the map when it came to selling things to them a couple of years ago. So there are new places, there are new opportunities for newer voices to get found and get exposed.
And you also don't know. We had a project a few years ago, Lights Out, that made it on the air on FX. Unfortunately, didn't make it past the first season. But it was a pitch, and the writer took it to all the cable networks, and it was a boxing show, and everybody passed, and the writer ended up writing it internally for us, and then we took the script out because they didn't want to buy it as a pitch, but when they saw the script, they wanted to buy it, and 2 networks bid on it, and FX won, and FX shot the pilot and then greenlit it to series. So there are many ways to get in it, and in some ways I feel like because there's so many more cable channels now and there's more competition, I think it's actually a little freer for writers. It used to feel like if they wrote their script for a certain network and that network passed on it, it was dead forever. In fact, I just Louis C.K. the comedian. Did you read that? He had a script he wrote 13 years ago when he was just starting out, and they brought it out again, and CBS is making it right now. So it's nice for writers to feel like there are more places for their voices to be heard. And even a decade ago, for staffing purposes, a lot of writers would be encouraged to write a spec, Everybody Loves Raymond or 6 Feet Under. And now everybody's writing original material, even baby writers and showrunners who have tons of writing experience and everybody knows they write beautifully. They're all writing original material, whether it's going to be for a writing sample to go on a staff and occasionally a writer. We had another one. We just shot a pilot for USA, and it was a spec that the writer had written, and we really liked it, and we actually thought it was going to go someplace like Showtime, and USA decided they wanted to do something edgier, and so they picked it up. So in some ways, it's a little bit of the Wild West in the marketplace.
Yeah,
for us.
I think in that respect, it is a classic best of times, worst of times. I think as much as the numerical odds are stacked against you, and as much as you feel like, there are all these writers with more fame and more experience who are more likely to make it than I will, there also really is an avid appetite for new stuff and new voices and new experiences. And really, television so much thrives on doing things that haven't been done before. I mean, one of the things that I learned, and this is very simplistic, but I have a small brain, so simplistic things stay with me, is from moving from the feature business into the television business, is that film is really about story, and television is really about character. And that's, like all simplistic statements, is not 100% true, and obviously a good feature film needs to have strong characters, and a good television show needs to have strong plotting. But at its heart, it's true. You sell movies by what is it about? What's the idea? It starts with a simple one-line premise, and that you can pitch to somebody, who can pitch it to somebody else, who can pitch it to somebody else who will give you money, and that's how it ends up in its 30-second spots and 15-second spots in an ad campaign. And it's really about story. Television is the opposite. I mean, plots of episodes come and go, and you don't really remember the plot of one episode versus another episode, but what stays with you is the spirit of the character, and that's what keeps you coming back episode after episode and year after year. And whether that's Sarah Linden, whether that's Dr. House, whether that's any of the memorable characters that have populated television, that's what keeps you coming back over and over and over again. And that's that quality of character, and how that character is specific, and how that character lives in a world that's specific, in a culture or a subculture that's specific. That's something that a writer can put down on paper and show you, and demonstrate to you and dramatize, and that's really the gift of what gets a series on the air. So that's, I think, where I think those of you who are in this room who are writers or creators, I would encourage you, because what we've been able to learn, even in our very small dabbling in this culture, in the Scandinavian culture, is that there's a lot of really wonderful character writing that comes out of here, and great characters always translate. So I think that's a lot of why we came by.
Okay, I think we're gonna move on to the next stage, but one last question from Marianne before you put it out. I'm just gonna remind everyone who's in the panel that they are in the panel. And you can come down and stand by the table while Marianne asks the question to David and Nancy.
Darn. There was not a faster pace in the storytelling, I think. I mean, others may disagree, but I think one thing, the Danish version took 20 episodes to tell its stories, but the hour-long episodes in Denmark are much longer than our American episodes, which are typically 42, 43 minutes in length. So we think that our 26 43-minute episodes pretty closely translate to the 57-ish minutes, whatever it is, of the Danish version. Now, we didn't go literally scene by scene and page by page to what they did, but I think we told it at a pretty similar pace by our standards. But yes, I think the U.S. audience did react in this is way slower than we're used to, and we're used to having mysteries that wrap up in 43 minutes, and when you start and there's a murder and you end and the killer is Irving, and it could have been Bill or Sally, but it's Irving, and we obviously took a lot more time, inspired by the Danish version, not only to deal with the complexities of an investigation that went through a lot more dead ends and red herrings and blocked alleys, but also to deal with the personal reactions of not only the investigators, but the people affected by the killing. And I think either people said, too slow for me, I'm checking out, or they said, wow, this is really different, and I really want to stay with it and stick with it. And I think, fortunately, a lot of people fell into the latter category. We don't have the viewing audience that CSI has or NCIS has, but we have a very loyal following that likes what we're doing, and we're happy with that.